Dee-dai, 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 dai, dai. Dee-dee-dai, dai, dee-dee-dai, dai, do. Dee-dee-dai, dai, dee-dee-dai, dee-dee-dai, dai, do. Dee-dee-dai, dee-dee-dai, dee-dee-do. Dee-dee-dai-dai, dee-dee-dai-dai-da. Dee-dee-dai-dai, dee-dee-dai-dai-da. Dee-dee-dai-dai, dee-dai-dai-dai-dai-dai-da. Hi-dai-dai, dee-dai-dai. Hi-ya-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Hi-ya-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Hi-ya-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na. Hanai, nai, 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 nai. Shalom, shalom, friends. That's Lamana Chai V'rayai, that we should seek peace for one another. Beautiful song about seeking peace for our brothers and sisters locally and in the world. We can use some of that. Okay, session number 17 is on creativity, the psychology of creativity. So let's start with a little poll question. When do I feel most creative? Option one, when I'm around creative people. Option two, at random, unpredictable moments. Option three, when I'm intentionally trying to be creative. Or option four, I rarely feel creative. 13% say it's more social. It's when you're around certain creative people. 63% say random, unpredictable moments. You just get great ideas. 13% say only when they're intentionally trying to be creative, and 13% say they rarely feel creative at all. Okay, very interesting. So, friends, humans possess a unique capacity to be creative. This creativity expresses itself in all kinds of ways in art, in writing, in self expression, the sciences, the financial sector, even spiritually, of course. Societies as a whole thrive when creativity abounds. Medical breakthroughs require creativity. Paradigm shifts in thinking require creativity. In some industries, we call creativity by a different name, innovation. People used to talk about Jewish innovation like a decade ago. Some say that innovation is actually applied creativity. Whatever you call it, creativity is a force that enables artists and researchers and businesses to meet the needs of people. So, what is creativity? Dr. Robert Frankl, a professor emeritus at the University of Calgary, defines creativity as the tendency to generate ideas, alternatives, or possibilities that help us solve problems, entertain ourselves, and communicate with each other. Indeed, creativity is also integral for self-discovery and self-expression. The writer and meditation teacher Anne Cushman notes that in her experience, fostering our creativity can lead to the healthier expression of feelings. She writes, instead of just being stuck and tied up inside, creativity gives the emotion somewhere to flow. I thought that was an interesting idea around creativity. Creativity leads to insights about ourselves and the world around us. Sometimes original ideas can emerge with an element of surprise, what some people call the light bulb moment. Other times, originality might emerge through a more sustained, continuous process. Some might call creativity a virtue, going back to the Greeks. It certainly is an important character trait. If you look back at the Greek philosophers, it's certainly not among the traits of a virtuous person. If you look at Aristotle's, dozen or so, virtues, he includes things like wisdom and bravery and temperance. Creativity is not there, but maybe it should be. Others might consider creativity to be more of a disposition than a trait, something you're born with. I'm naturally more creative or not creative. We were often told as a kids. The questions that arise, can creativity be taught? Or is it an innate personality type? These questions are especially relevant in the field of education. One school of thought argues that creativity is not something that can be taught. Some people are simply wired to be more creative. Others argue that creativity can be cultivated. As a 2011 article in the Chronicle of Higher Education asserted, creativity is cultivated through rigorous training and by deliberately practicing certain core abilities and skills over an extended period of time. A third possibility is that we are born creative, but we lose it over time. British author and speaker Ken Robinson asserts that all children are innately creative, and it is, in fact, our system of education that so often crushes our creativity, putting us in desks, telling us to memorize facts. As we attempt to thrive in education systems that, without exception, prioritize academic achievement, Robinson argues we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. There's also the question of the spiritual and moral dimension of creativity. When I refer to moral imagination, I'm talking about solving moral problems beyond the limits of what has been presented to us. This might mean coming up with new kinds of pragmatic solutions for problems. Such a concept of creative morality recalls the Aristotelian notion of phronesis, or practical wisdom, which refers to decisions made not only on universality, but also on practicality and the experience that comes with age. My instinct is that morality is especially served by empathetic imagination, which makes it possible to develop new insights into empathy, allowing us to understand people in ways we didn't before. Now, on this point of creativity not necessarily being a virtue, let me give an example. You can be creative for evil means. Let me give an example. One could argue the Trump solution to Gaza is creative. Oh, well, that's creative. I never thought of the cleansing before, like actually just removing millions of people from their land. Well, that's how refreshing to have a creative idea, right? But even though it might be something that people weren't talking about or thinking very much about it, right? It's hard to claim it's virtuous to simply have a new idea that people weren't talking about if it implies the suffering of millions of people. Some of the most insightful modern thinking on creativity comes to us from Dr. Howard Gardner. He's a name people should know, a research professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Gardner is perhaps most well known for his theory of multiple intelligences, which critiques the notion that the only meaningful kind of intelligence can be measured through psychometric tests such as the IQ test or SAT tests. Regarding creativity, Gardner shares the psychological understanding that creative thinkers are people who in some ways think divergently. Although creativity is linked to intelligence, it can also diverge from intelligence in that those assessed as intelligent will often be focused on finding the so-called right answer, right? They want to follow the rules and give the correct fact or answer. Well, creative people might be more inclined to generate the greatest possible number of answers. Very interesting way of thinking. That's different than intelligence as it's generally assessed. 10 years after the publication of his groundbreaking book on multiple intelligences, Gardner published a book that examined the question of creativity through case studies of the lives of several people considered geniuses, including the likes of Freud and Einstein and Picasso. In this book, Gardner fleshes out the typical life and trajectory of the creative genius, from experiencing both love and marginality in childhood to retaining childlike qualities as an adult, mastering her field, to ultimately experiencing a series of breakthroughs that change her field forever. Of a special interest to Gardner are the losses and costs of having such extraordinary brilliance and ambition. Often pursuing creative genius comes at the cost of one's health, personal life, and human connection. Gardner likens this to a Faustian bargain. There's also the question of mental health. In cases of exceptional creativity, there's higher instances of psychopathology. Dean Keith Simonton, a professor of psychology at the University of California, Davis, has dubbed this the mad genius paradox. In fact, creative thinking and disordered thinking share what's called reduced latent inhibition, which refers to an inability to filter out ostensibly less relevant information. You may have had some maddening conversations with people who don't know how to filter out the important and the less important. And like if you know me, if I want to have a conversation, I want to stay on a topic for 3 minutes so we can go to the next topic for 3 minutes. And and I struggle with conversations that where we you can't filter out the less important stuff and the more important stuff. But these mad geniuses struggle with reduced latent inhibition. It's also been suggested that for those with a predisposition for mental illness, accelerated creative output can act, perhaps temporarily, as a buffer between the genius and their mental struggles. Right, one who retains so many possibilities in their heads, and it might be difficult to prioritize kind of a moral importance of all these range of possibilities for a genius. While we have thus far talked about creativity as a virtue, as I mentioned, albeit a sometimes hazardous one, we might also acknowledge that there's a scientifically studied correlation between creativity and immorality. Oh, very interesting. When coming up with solutions to a problem, say that one wishes to get entry into an event with sold out tickets, we can imagine how some especially creative solutions might be especially unethical. For example, hacking into the Ticketmaster website, very creative, as opposed to simply buying tickets from a ticket app, right? More ethical, less creative. The link between immorality and creativity has led to the development of the concept of dark creativity, also sometimes called malevolent creativity. It refers to the generation of creative ideas or expressions that are selfish, negative, or intentionally harmful. An example of dark creativity would be those who find new and creative ways to use AI technology to scam unsuspecting people. The potential drives behind dark creativity are varied, but include a desire for power, a need for resources, or even a sadistic delight at the suffering of others. Perhaps not surprisingly, those associated with dark creativity often exhibit that most dangerous triad of personality traits: psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Now, excuse me if I offend anyone's political sensibilities. For me, the paradigm of malevolent creativity is Elon Musk. This is someone who's clearly brilliant, is clearly innovative and creative, but whose motives I have not an ounce of trust for in terms of how he would think about the goodness of technologies or the risk of technologies. Is it merely to make him a buck, or is there any concern for the welfare of society? And as innovation is so linked to wealth these days, I think we have to be more and more concerned with some of these advancements and regulations around them. Different conversation. It seems fair for me to say that creativity itself is not inherently a virtue. Rather, it can be used for good, for evil, or for not pure nonsense. The same can be said of technology itself. Just because technology is new doesn't make it good. After all, new technology can be a world-destroying atom bomb. Often people have the tendency to celebrate creativity as purely good and praiseworthy, when in fact more harm than good can often come from the most creative endeavors. So what does creativity occupy in Jewish thought? I'd like to bring your attention to a famous teaching by Rav Kook. Hayashan yitkadesh v'hakadash yitkadesh. I love this phrase, and it's one to memorize if you don't know it yet. Hayashan yitkadesh v'hakadash yitkadesh. It kind of rhymes a little as well. The old shall be made new, and the new shall be made holy. This teaching touches on a sweet spot in Judaism, where there is a value both on tradition and innovation and creativity. Of course, it's all too easy to get stuck in one or the other, but the truth is we need both. The Talmudic enterprise was generally about finding a balance between freedom and restraint. The rabbis were deeply concerned with finding new and creative ways to interpret our most sacred texts. And indeed, it was because of their radical thinking that Judaism was able to survive the diaspora. However, the rabbis were also too deeply concerned with fealty to the Torah and making sure that Jews continued to honor Torah commandments. As we are told in Pirkei Avot, the rabbis of the Talmud were charged to build a fence around the Torah, meaning to protect biblical mitzvot. By the way, if this was a different conversation, I would want to explore Jewish creativity as it relates to diaspora versus the land of Israel. On the one hand, Jewish scholarship in the land of Israel is far more creative because Jews in Israel are just far more learned than diaspora Jews in general. And most obviously because they speak the native language. And having access to Hebrew gives you access to just wealth of texts and understandings. On the other hand, Israel can be viewed as the new shtetl. It's a new shtetl where you're just mostly surrounded by Jews. There's a creativity that emerges for Jews in the diaspora being surrounded around diversity and our ability to integrate different systems of thought. Anyways, that's a different debate, which we can return to later if you're interested. The tension between creativity and tradition is alive and well today in Jewish communities. On the one hand, we have traditionalists who want to put up more fences, often by issuing injunctions called gezerot, to preserve the way things have always been. On the other hand, there's those in the radically progressive religious group who can see innovation of all ritual and mitzvot as the pinnacle of achievement. Why shouldn't you reinvent the rituals every year? I think it's necessary to celebrate both the protection of tradition and the innovation that allows our traditions to stay alive. In fact, I think it's a distortion of Judaism to only celebrate one. Think about the upcoming Pesach Seder, right? Right, the opportunities with Pesach Seder to really root one's family within these beautiful, timeless traditions, but also to offer creative insight and creative ritual as alongside that. One of the ones that drives some of my friends crazy is that we add many things to our Seder plate. We got the tomato on there. We got the orange on there, right? We have a lock and key on there for criminal justice, right? We got we got a mushroom on there, right? So, what are you doing, Shmuly? Like, come on, keep the Seder plate. It's Seder plate, Okay, we have a Seder plate, but we've got some innovation on our Seder plate. So maybe you're in the camp that says, don't mess with the Seder plate. Maybe you're in the camp that likes to play around with it a little bit. So we can't talk about creativity without talking about creation. Let's talk about creation. They come, of course, from the same Latin verb, creare, meaning to make or bring forth. It is God who is the ultimate creator. In the Jewish tradition, only God can create something out of nothing. In Christian theology, this is referred to as creation ex nihilo. In Jewish theology, God creating something from nothingness is referred to yesh me'ayin, right? Something from nothing. Literally, this phrase means there is from there isn't, but is used in the sense of something out of nothing. Humans, by contrast, cannot create ex nihilo. We create yesh me'yesh, something from something, one might argue. Even though we cannot create as the divine creates, when we do act creatively and with good intention, we are emulating the divine. Some of the greatest insights on creativity in the Jewish tradition come to us from great 20th century Jewish thinker Rav Soloveitchik, who distinguished between completely changing tradition versus innovating from within the tradition, as opposed to from without. The former, which he calls shinui, from the Hebrew word for change, constitutes a sharp break from tradition, he argues. The latter, which he calls chidush, from the word for new, operates from within tradition. By revitalizing our traditions rather than throwing them out entirely, Rav Soloveitchik writes that we are able to become creative partners with God, contributing to the unfolding of the Torah's meanings. So let me unpack that again, because I think this is really important for one possible litmus test as to whether Jewish innovation is authentic or not. He says shinui versus chidush. Shinui is changing Judaism, right? He thinks that's invalid, versus chidush, which is innovating Judaism from within Judaism. Both of them might lead to the same result, but the methodology might be different, right? My own sense here is the more Torah one knows, or attending Jewish learning consistently, the more creative one can be. People who don't know much Judaism, it's very hard to be creative from within, right? The more you know, actually, the more creative you can be. People think of it as the opposite. The most rigid are the people who know the most. It doesn't have to be that way. It's one thing to completely disregard traditions and teachings and replace them with something new. But if we take time to learn Torah deeply, we're able to see the vastness of what's possible for Jewish life. So that's why I hope Valley Beit Midrash is a spring of innovation and creativity, because by deepening adult learning, our goal is to empower the community not just to adhere or obey to Jewish learning, right, but to be creative and offer insights and new models for Jewish life. Right. That's why VBM was always intended to be a learning center and an innovation center. The learning and innovation are connected. Such a productive relationship between Jewish innovation and tradition is illustrated by a wonderful story from the Talmud, which is sometimes referred to as Moshe in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. If you're not familiar with the story, I think you'll like it. If you are familiar, it's worth thinking about again. In this Agadah, which means Talmudic story, we're told that when Moses went up to Sinai to receive Torah, he had a brief exchange with God that led to God transporting him hundreds and hundreds of years into the future, right into a lesson being taught by Rabbi Akiva, a sage of the 1st and 2nd century Common Era. Right? So the rabbis already know about time travel. Right? They're like, Moshe got into a time travel machine and went 1,400 years further into Rabbi Akiva's classroom. We're told that Moses, the greatest prophet of all time, sits at the back of Akiva's class and he's very confused. He's sitting in the back of Akiva's classroom. I imagine Akiva's pretty close, pretty confused also. But he's very confused sitting in the back of the class. And he begins to get dejected. Suddenly, one of Rabbi Akiva's students asks, "My teacher, from where did you derive this innovative teaching you're teaching us?" Rabbi Akiva responds that the teaching is derived from what Moses received at Mount Sinai. At this, we are told Moses is comforted. So in the figure of the great sage and martyr Rabbi Akiva, we see the Jewish need for creativity and innovation following the destruction of the great temple in Jerusalem by the Romans. How else could our people have survived the diaspora? In the figure of Moses, we see a representation of the most ancient texts and traditions that form the foundation of Judaism. That this Talmudic story shows a relationship between the two. The rabbis of the Talmud did not throw away the written Torah in order to innovate rabbinic Judaism. To put in Rav Soloveitchik's terms, the Talmud is chidush, not shinui, innovation, not change. Right? So just to unpack the Rabbi Akiva story, in case I said it too quickly, Rabbi Akiva is teaching an innovation. Moses is in the back scared because he says, "What is this? This is not religion. This is not Judaism. Like, what is this stuff? I didn't know anything about this. How could this be Judaism?" And then the student asks Rabbi Akiva, like, "How do you know what you're saying is Jewish?" And he says, "Because this is the law given to Moses." And Moses doesn't recognize it at all, but he's comforted because the idea is that the innovation is built into the language of continuity, even when it's unrecognizable from the beginning, right? To be a slave abolitionist would be unrecognizable in the Torah, but it clearly has its continuity in Jewish values. Such a continuity project is not a lark. We're not playing a game of make-believe, pretending that there is a direct line between Sinai and our Jewish practices today. Because there is a direct line, continuity means deeply rooting ourselves in the foundational Jewish texts. Within these traditions, where there is innovation done at its best, it is rooted in the old while allowing for new possibilities. For example, in the 1970s, a movement began to include the matriarchs in the Amidah prayer, where historically only the patriarchs were named. Those invested in a feminist reimagining of Jewish liturgy could have decided to not say the Amidah prayer at all, instead replacing it with a new one, free of patriarchal history. However, they didn't do this. By making creative updates to the current liturgy from within the traditional unfolding of the Siddur, they had the opportunity to continue to say the prayers that Jews have said for generations, while also adding to those prayers to reflect their current feminist values. By the way, friends, this is going to be one of the shortest presentations. I have just a little bit left, and then I'm going to open the conversation. So here I want to make a distinction between halachic innovation and interpretive innovation. Halachic innovation refers to the realm of praxis, how we go about applying the commandments, so to speak, to our daily lives. Interpretive innovation is a much less restrictive endeavor traditionally. We're encouraged to read the Torah for our whole lives, continuing to think about what the stories mean to us and how we can deepen our understanding by radical reinterpretation. If you read a Parsha on Noah and you give a new drash that relates to Noah's experience in the ark to the current reality of AI, you're in no way breaking from Jewish tradition by offering this new read of the story, even if you're covering topics our patriarchs could not have dreamt of. Rather, by drushing freely, you're actually participating in the great Jewish tradition of engaging creatively with the stories that tell us who we are. In terms of innovations within Judaism, I've identified what I would consider the four most vital veins of innovation. First, we have the issue of inclusivity on various levels. This can be as simple as the decision to adjust our word choice in order to acknowledge bodies of different abilities. For example, at points in the service when we are to rise, being instructed to rise if you are able, the small innovations on word choice can make a huge difference in terms of embracing a Judaism that embraces all Jews. Second, after inclusivity, is the issue of how Jewish tradition has adapted to the reality of Jewish political sovereignty. Before the foundation of the modern state of Israel in 1948, there was no Jewish nation state. The return to the land of Israel raised many questions about the relationship between Jewish law and government. Should Israel be a halachic state, meaning one governed by Jewish law or by Jewish values? Or should it be a secular state in which Jews are safe to live according to their different values? These questions continue to be debated fiercely in Israel. Another vein of halachic innovation is in relation to technology. In outlining the practices of Shabbat, our sages had no way of imagining the advent of the digital age. It has taken a robust commitment to reinterpreting Jewish law for us to formulate a cohesive understanding of what it means to observe Shabbat in the iPhone era, right? For many, they want to have screens up in the middle of service because why wouldn't you use technology to enhance the service? For others, they want to unplug. In fact, there's even a Jewish cultural movement now of unplugging, detached from a religious movement, unplugging one day a week. Finally, there's the question of how Judaism overlaps and intersects with ideology. Classically, the ideologies shaping Judaism have included one such as socialism, capitalism, and feminism. As we enter an era of unparalleled change, rapid unparalleled change, when the sharing of ideas has been almost completely democratized by the internet and related technologies, it takes a certain creativity in Jewish leadership to stay relevant amidst all the paradigm shifts of the last 2 decades. How, for example, might we apply Torah values as we think about shaping AI technology? Lots to talk about there. All innovation, including Jewish innovation, must be convincing. It's not enough simply to be brilliantly creative, right? I used to, one of the quotes I love from Heschel, he says, I used to be most impressed by the most brilliant person in the room. Now I'm most impressed by the kindest person in the room. That's true for me as well. I used to be most impressed by who I thought had the smartest Jewish insights. I wanted VBM speakers who were brilliant, right? But now I'm much more impressed by people who I know to live kindly, right? In addition to being good teachers, right? But if I could choose for VBM, a good teacher who I know to be kind, or a brilliant teacher who I know to be a little bit of a doofus, moral doofus, right? I would choose the former. I think my kids laugh when I still use the word doofus because I think it's kind of like a 1980s word, but I love the word doofus. In any case, all innovation, including Jewish innovation, must be convincing. It's not simply enough to be brilliant and creative. We must create innovations that people actually feel called to implement. After all, tradition is ultimately concerned with lived application. In Talmudic discourse, there's a concept called ukimta, which broadly refers to resolving a tension between seemingly contradictory applications of law. The reality is that when our situation changes, so too will our application change. Jewish practices are not done in a vacuum. vacuum. They're always being adapted in relation to external stimuli. Let me just unpack that real briefly, because it's an important idea. One of the most radical ideas in the Talmud is called ukimta. And what the way the rabbis, the sages innovated was by saying ukimta. They said, we can make a change or an innovation. Why? Because the situation has changed. They don't have a text proof. They don't have a logical proof. They just say something in society has changed that necessitates a new application. Friends, to conclude, there's something inherently creative about being part of a tradition that is constantly reviving itself. I don't think it's a coincidence how disproportionately Jews are represented in the great creative thinkers of modernity. Einstein, Marx, Freud, just to name a few. Jews represent just 0.2% of the global population, but a whopping 22% of recipients of the Nobel Prize are of Jewish heritage. Maybe you also get an email every month from nice Jews in their 80s who like to remind you of how many Nobel Prize Jews get, listing all those Nobel Prize. It's a generational obsession with American Jewish success that younger Jews can't relate to as much. But I'm in that kind of that older Jewish category of also being blown away by that. Do I think that Jews are innately or genetically more intelligent? Absolutely not. Rather, I think our collective success in the world as innovators is in part reflective of a culture that encourages us to be creative and dialectical rather than dogmatic and rigid in relation to our most sacred traditions and texts. Okay, dear friends, that is my presentation, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on creativity. Yes, Lauren Blatt, why don't you kick us off?
It's so integral to Judaism. I was the first, as soon as you started, I thought of last week's Parsha Teruma. The building of the Mishkan is really an act of creativity. Everybody's involved. And then we later on, we're going to hear about Bezalel and the Academy for Arts is called the Bezalel Academy. So it's neat. But also, Parshanut involves creativity. Midrash is creativity, and music. I mean, we've lately had a flowering of people like Batya Levine and Joey Weisberg and that. So I think it's I hadn't thought of it but as much before you brought it up, but it's really very much a part of Jewish life.
Lauren, I'm so glad you said that. And I hope as parents or grandparents or as teachers or however we engage with younger Jews, we can remember the importance of creativity. Often we're concerned with assimilation for our kids and grandkids. And so we want to pump them with facts. Oh, they don't know anything. They need to know more stuff. They need to know more stuff. But, right, I think actually what they need to know is, in addition, more important than knowing Jewish facts, is knowing how to creatively engage with Jewish texts, right? Don't just make sure they know the Haggadah, what the Haggadah says. Make sure they feel empowered to creatively engage with the Haggadah in a way that speaks to them, right? So they can realize that Jewish thinking is not about knowing facts. Jewish learning is about creative relationship to those histories and values. Thank you, Lauren. Hi, Cheryl.
There you go. Hi. For better or for worse, you described conservative Judaism in all of the innovations regarding rethinking how to effectively include people with disabilities, people who are not male, all of those things. That it's become, in conservative Judaism is very, very inclusive, and that, that's where I'm coming from. But I also find sometimes it gets some of the other things that weren't part of the things that you mentioned in trying to do a lot of inclusivity and rethinking and creative implementation. Some of the stuff gets watered down. So
yes, great, Cheryl. Yeah, very interesting. And it's and it's so interesting how, divided we are. If you look, the reform critiques of the conservative movement would be like, inclusive, what are you talking about? You still won't do intermarriages. You're still using Hebrew in your prayer books, right? When American Jews don't know Hebrew, right? You're still using the language of Jewish law when the high majority of American Jews don't care about law, right? And then the Orthodox critique of conservatives, whoa, they changed everything, right? And so Reform and Orthodox, they're all going to critique each other. But within conservative, I think the conservative discourse is one of striking that balance. And so I think that each movement has their own articulation of how their movement is the one doing it right, right? They're not innovating too fast, or they're not losing tradition too fast. And I think it's interesting, being that I'm immersed in all of the denominations so deeply. I find it fascinating to listen to those conversations. I'm very curious to see where we end up in 10 years from now. Will the conservative movement approve intermarriage, and rabbis officiating intermarriage? Will it reduce or increase Hebrew, right? Will it move away from the language of law, given the divide between rabbis and lay people on that? But yeah, thank you for that. I think the conservative movement has filled a really important gap in that landscape of around those relationships. Orthodoxy arguably being too slow to change, reform movement are arguably being too fast to change. So yeah, thank you for that. Oh,
Jump in.
you
Oh,
also, Gary, you have a Beret Priha coffee also. Beret Priha coffee. It's a great coffee mug. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Hi, David Newman.
hey. So yeah, sorry, I'm also iPad. Yeah, one of my iterations in my path was teaching at New City School in St. Louis, which was based on Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And just to put in a hurrah for, those ideas that, bodily kinesthetic, musical, logical, mathematical, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalist. So where are the diplomats, these days? Well, those people that have interpersonal creativity and intrapersonal, where's the awareness, the self-awareness, the authenticity? So as a means of teaching kids to focus on all of these areas, not just reading, writing, and math, as much as those are very, very, very important, but there's more to people than just test taking. And I think schools, can do a great job if they're looking at the whole person and trying to, accept people and give them breathing room to be creative. It feels better to feel creative
Right.
when you're on a job and they're telling you, sit down at your desk. I just want ABC versus I trust you and go for it, employee, and create things. It's much better, I think.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. I wonder if one of the fears of creativity, tell me if you agree with this, and I don't think most parents would articulate it this way, but subconsciously, a fear of creativity and multiple intelligences is that what does a parent want for their child, or many parents might want for their child, is success and security. I mean, think about this a lot, as we discussed. And what does it take to be successful? To fit in with the system, to play by the rules, to get into the good school based upon the good test scores, and then to make the income because you're offering what's and I think that it's very scary to think about multiple intelligence and creativity, because you might be downplaying the priority of advancing in the socially accepted measures of success, of how you're going to climb and in order to make money and be successful. And I think that this might be one of the fears of why we don't teach our kids to be creative. I'm curious if anyone agrees or disagrees with that. But let's go to you, Stan.
Think anybody's more creative than our rabbis who taught us years ago. They taught us about the Pigeon Ben. They taught us how to sell chametz through our rabbis. They have multiple interpretations about the binding of Isaac, and that is creativity. And it's scholarship, but it's creativity. And and I think it's a major part of being Jewish. And those of us who work in the secular world, we're well aware of the fact that our colleagues will say, "What do you believe? Do you believe in heaven and hell? Do you have faith? What do you do?" And we can't really say that. I always like the interpretation with the word Yisrael, who wrestled with God, and I think that's what we do. So that's
Yes.
where I come from.
I love that. I love that. What strikes me is also really powerful, what Stan is touching on here, is that if you're a person who lives with multiple possibilities, right? Moral problems have multiple solutions. The way to read a text has multiple possibilities. It's easy to then be a relativist. You stand for nothing because you just have multiple possibilities. But I think the sweet spot for Jews is, how do you continually be morally passionate and morally clear, so to speak, but also still hold moral possibilities, right? You can take many perspectives, but still have moral clarity, right? And I think we live in a time right now of a lack of moral creativity, but also a lack of passion for fighting for what people ultimately believe in. An era of selfishness and greed in many ways. And Stan, I really appreciate you touching on, because the rabbi's creativity, first and foremost, was about solving problems. People had social problems, economic problems, just looking at the things you touched on, and they wanted to find solutions. How do we honor the tradition, but also address these social problems? And I think that, again, today, we're going to have to do better than just politically screaming out the same tropes that people screamed for years, hoping the other side will just be convinced if we're louder, right? We're going to actually have to think about, solutions to some of these problems that are getting buried in the sand right now. Yeah. Okay. Hi, Gary.
Morning, everyone. I want to push back just a little bit what you said about parenting and success and whatever you said. I don't want to misquote you, but it rung a bell with me because that may be a lot what parents think. But what's the definition of success? So who in our society do we think are successful? People that make lots of money, people that are on television. We don't think about being successful if you're a school teacher, or maybe if you're a rabbi, or a priest, or whatever. It's always based upon money, and I find that that's not a good societal goal. Is looking at dollars equal success. So, I mean, I have to push back that a little bit, and that is some parenting, and a lot of that is society. The second thing I wanted to mention, one of the issues about creativity is that even though we have create in Judaism, we've become creative, but we struggle with the secular versus the Jewish world. So we want to make all these changes because it sounds good, but do we really participate in those things? It just sounds good that we made these changes. I have a friend that's a rabbi my age, and raising his children, he had a problem because he wanted them to experience Americana, but at the same time he wanted to live in the Jewish world, and that's a constant struggle, even for himself. He wanted his kids to play swim, and swim meets are on Shabbat. So he worked around where his children would stay at a home where the meet was. But it was still always a struggle, and so that's an issue with are we over creative or are we under creative? Because I have many friends in the Orthodox world that have that same struggle. So that's my point there.
Okay. Awesome, Gary. Such interesting stuff. Because one thought on your first comment around the proper framing of success. One of the reasons at VBM we don't publicly honor philanthropists in the way. Instead, the awards we give out at our public events are for those who are kind of engaged in humble service, acts of service. Whether they're just making sandwiches or they're volunteering on a weekly basis. And I think that's a response to the Jewish world, which mostly is just doing gala dinners honoring people for their donations. Now, I get that. Like, nonprofits need to survive. We need to celebrate philanthropists. But I think that we're trying to respond to that. That actually success is not simply financial success, and even some philanthropic engagement with that philanthropic financial success. Even though that's one measure, but that the success we want to celebrate is virtue and character and service. So yeah, I very much appreciate that, and that's one intervention we're trying to make on that front.
Good morning. All the discussion has been quite interesting, and part of that is the difficulty, though, of defining what is creativity, and going back to your first point as to what the morality of creativity is. And it appears to me that like you said, creativity has no moral value. It could be good, it could be bad. You know, there is no pure science, there is no pure art. It's going to, at some point, have an effect on people, and the effect on people is not necessarily a good one just because it's something new, nor is it necessarily a bad one because it's something new. But we don't get to a better world without the experiment. So the morality, I believe, of creativity is that it gives us the opportunity to progress into society, to have our rules reflect the technology that we live in today, to have our actions be able to be as broad as possible. And it also, I was thinking that the most creative people, I think, are the ones who actually know the basis for what they're doing, whether it's in Jewish law or in art. I mean, Picasso, as an example, I mean, and you can't imagine an artist more creative than Picasso, having invented so many different kinds of things, was marvelously traditionally trained. I mean, he was a great 19th century artist. He could do anything that any of the best of the 19th century artists could do, and yet that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to move the idea of art forward. And so it's important to have, I think it's important to have the basis in what the history tells us, but be able to understand that we do live in a different world now than the 15th century or the 19th century, and that our problems are different than they were then. And just like our Talmudic rabbis understood that they had to update Judaism for the technology that they had in their age, it's important for us to be able to do the same today.
Yes, awesome, very cool. You know, relevant to the Picasso idea also is kind of a Beethoven Mozart comparison as well as, you know, in regards to mastering the art and whether you know, write your musical notes and you're done, or you engage in kind of a lot of eraser marks and you're kind of correcting and fixing, and how much do you master the art and then transcend it versus create from the start. And I think you're very much right that those who were trained traditionally are able to be far more creative oftentimes because of their mastery of what's come before them before they surpass it. Um, However, I do, you know, I mean, there is a counter argument, but that's for another time. So yeah, a very interesting point. Thank you. All right. Anyone else we haven't heard from, or circle back to folks we have heard from?
I was gonna jump in just to say again, creativity feels good. And so that kind of relates to our talk about flow. And, you know, for those of us that are retired or this stage of life, you know, trying something new, taking a risk, just being creative, you know, in cooking or painting or whatever it is, it's what a wonderful thing to think that there are new possibilities, and being old doesn't just mean, oh, I've done it all, or I'm locked into my own little room. You know, just it's a moment of creativity, can be.
Well, a conversation about AI for a moment. You know, one of the ways to think about AI from a Jewish lens is through the word for intelligence in Jewish tradition, which is dat. Dat means intelligence, but it means more than that. And if you look at dat throughout the Jewish literature, it never means being able to pull from massive amounts of data. What it means is kind of a moral discernment, an ability to make priorities among nuances. And AI does not have that by and large. AI can pull from vast amounts of information, but its inability to be our moral compass ultimately, right? We can't solve our ethical dilemmas by asking AI what to do, right? And I think in that sense, AI cannot be called dot, right? And so, yes, there's a creativity with AI and a tool that's useful, but it would fall short of being called, even its most advanced forms, of being called intelligence, even though it's called artificial intelligence, right? From a Jewish perspective, I think. And yet, I think more and more we're going to see people look towards AI as their rabbi, so to speak, or as their ethical, you know, solution. And I think that the creativities of these technologies, we're going to have far more nuance than ever in figuring out what part is the human responsibility still beyond these incredibly creative tools that bring knowledge to our doorsteps. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that. Or here's one other case that's relevant. The programming of self-driving cars in many cases are going to be programmed with some moral solutions, right? And we've touched on this in the past, but just to touch on it again, on one side you have two black girls walking on a sidewalk, and on one side you have two white boys walking, or on one side you have five seniors, and on one side you have three children. How will the car be programmed as to which side to swerve in the case it needs to swerve when it sees these? It will have to make a choice, and it'll have to be programmed towards a choice. So, this is a case where values will indeed be put into the world of robotics, but whose values? Yeah, Matthew.
The there is a law in Germany now dealing with this. It's been around for a while that prioritizes human life over property. Because if you're driving your car and you have a choice of hitting someone or wrecking your car, pulling off to the side, hitting a tree or something, people will not hit the person. They'll wreck their car. That is now law in Germany for the last 10 or 15 years. That simple choice, but someone had to think about it. That you're driving and all of a sudden your brakes are failing. Do you go into the crosswalk and hit someone, or do you crash your car? All AI or robotic cars in Germany must value life above property. And then the question becomes which life when there are two lives to choose. And it is the ultimate ethical question on robotic cars. But the question is, how do you make that decision?
Great. Yeah, thank you. This is a fascinating point, actually, because there's a little contradiction in human psychology that I want to just expose. Like Matthew just touched on, let's say we knew crashing our new car into the tree would cost us $4,000 of damage. I mean, most people have insurance, so it's not going to be that there's a deductible. But let's say it was going to cost $4,000. When you hit the tree. I think most ethical people, or we would deem most ethical people, would choose take the $4,000 of damage on your car rather than kill or severely damage, this pedestrian, right? Everybody would agree, right? Better to have $4,000 damage than kill or hurt this person. I think most people would agree. Now let's say you heard that a stranger on the other side of the world is going to die if you don't donate $4,000. I think most people would not feel morally compelled to have to send $4,000 to a stranger to save their life, right? Because what do I know this person for? So in the case of the car, where we might do harm, we're clear that losing $4,000 is the more moral choice than killing or hurting the person. In the case where I would have to send $4,000 to save someone's life, or they will, right? I think most people are clear that's not my responsibility. But I'm curious how people think about that.
I wanted to address what you just said about the AI and morality. From what I'm not a computer scientist, but from what I know, all this information that the AI computers pull from is what's out there, what they glean from articles written, books, art, on and on and on and on. So we know there's good and bad, and so where they pull their information from really depends on if they can make that moral decision. So if the world is heavily information is heavily on one side or the other, it's just a computer. It doesn't take the place of our ability, as you just said, to make that decision. So we see that in society now changing, where AI has just a little bit of information. We see how moral judgment and ethics have changed through social media compared to where it used to be, where people are much more to themselves and what have you. So I don't know if we could ever trust some computer to make ethical or moral decisions for us, because it's just pulling from what's out there.
Yes. So let me give two examples building on what Gary's saying. One would be, imagine if some of the owners of search engines or whatever tools they're owning, right, they actually bumped up the credibility of Holocaust denial, right? Where now that was the first answer you got in searches, did the Holocaust happen, is now actually the claims of those who deny the Holocaust, right? Now, AI is going to pull the data that has the most weight, and Holocaust denial grows. In fact, we're seeing some trends like that are very scary. Another example is AI can only pull data from existing data. It can't engage in logical deduction like humans do. Humans are able, through critical thought, to not only pull data and decipher amidst data, but engage in logical deduction beyond the data. AI can't do that. It can just pull data. So I think your point is very well taken, and I think it's something to be concerned about. Yes, Lauren, you get the closing comment here.
Yeah. Just for your other thing about like $4,000 for somebody far away. But it wouldn't have to be $4,000 for you. It would. I mean, how often do I get an email from somebody maybe in Israel who needs some kind of surgery that's not performed there? And so everybody gives a little, and that all adds up. And I think that's just part of being a Jew and chesed. The other thing with AI is, I think we have to look at it as only a tool, like a calculator, like a slide rule from years before. Can't put all our trust in it. Like you say, it's guys like Elon Musk use it towards the bad, towards the evil. So we got to be really careful. It's not a moral thing. It's just a tool.
Yes.
Anyways.
Good. Thank you. Okay. Well, great to see everyone. I loved learning from you, and wishing everyone a beautiful day, and hope to see you next week. Be well.